mocked, freezing, forgotten. Then he placed his coat on her shoulders. Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Winter gripped the Montana Territory in 1882 with a cold so sharp it seemed to whisper through the bones. The train station at Clearwater Junction stood half buried in snow, a lonely platform of cracked planks and peeling paint that groaned under each gust of wind. Snow sifted sideways through the air, blanketing everything in a relentless white. No train had arrived in hours, and none would come again that day. Susanna Miller sat curled at the far end of the bench, her thin frame trembling under a threadbare coat. The hem of her dress had gone stiff from the damp, her canvas satchel clutched tight to her chest, as if it were the last thread keeping her tethered to this world. At 18, she had thought herself brave enough to answer a mail-order bride advertisement. She had dreamed of stepping off the train into a new life. Instead, the man who had summoned her had looked her up and down with a hard, dismissive gaze and said only, "Too young, too plain." Then he had turned his back and trudged off through the swirling snow without another word. The station agent had muttered something about no refunds before disappearing into his office, leaving her to the silent company of the men on the opposite bench. They were older, rough around the edges, their faces half-shadowed under wide-brimmed hats. They watched her like a hawk watches a rabbit. "She's got nowhere to go," one whispered, his lips curling. "Shame," said another, chuckling low. "Might freeze out here." One man stood reeking of whiskey swagger, rolling through his shoulders as he crunched toward her. "You lost little girl," he drawled. Susanna's throat locked. She could only clutch her bag tighter, her knuckles white against the canvas heart, pounding so loud it drowned the hiss of the wind. The man leaned down, his breath sour. "I asked you a question. Leave her be." The voice cut clean through the storm. The man froze. He turned slowly. A figure stood just beyond him, tall and broad-shouldered snow clinging to the brim of his hat and the folds of his heavy coat. His jaw was dark with a winter beard, and in the crook of one arm a small child blinked sleepily beneath a wool bonnet. Caleb McAllister didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. The drunk muttered something and slunk back to his bench. The laughter of his companions died in their throats. Caleb's eyes shifted to Susanna. She sat stiff as a frostbitten branch, eyes wide, lips trembling. He crouched beside her, his voice low but steady. "Come on. No one should sit out in this cold." Susanna didn't move. Her gaze darted to the child in his arms, a little girl, maybe 3 years old, with round cheeks and wary, knowing eyes. She didn't cry. She just stared. Caleb shrugged off his thick wool coat and draped it gently over Susanna's shoulders. She gasped softly, not from the warmth, but from the shock of kindness, as if touch itself had become foreign. He didn't ask questions. He simply shifted the child into Susanna's arms. "Hold her a minute," he said, quiet but firm. "She's warm." The little girl's body radiated heat like a living ember, and Susanna found herself clutching her instinctively. The child didn't struggle, didn't fuss, just nestled against her as if she belonged there. Caleb helped Susanna to her feet, his gloved hand steady at her elbow. Her legs wobbled under her. "You need food and shelter," he said. "I've got both. You're coming with me." It wasn't phrased like a request, but somehow it didn't feel like a command either. It felt like a rope thrown to someone drowning. Outside the station, 2 sturdy bay horses stamped their hooves in the snow before a small sleigh. Caleb wrapped a wool blanket around her and lifted her gently into the seat. He climbed in, reins in hand, and the sleigh glided off into the white. The world blurred past in muted shades of gray and silver. Susanna said nothing. She just held the warm-breathing child close, feeling her own shaking hands begin to still. Somewhere deep inside her chest, something small flickered, not quite hope, but maybe the room for it. The journey wound toward the distant foothills where the snow lay heavy across the pines. Hours later, the cabin came into view, tucked at the base of a ridge. Its roof sloped low under a thick drift, a thin ribbon of smoke curling from the chimney. When Caleb pushed the door open, a wave of heat from the wood stove rushed out to meet them. It wasn't just warmth, it was human. "I don't have much," Caleb said, his voice gruff but not unkind as he took the child from her arms. "But it's dry. You can sleep in the grain room. It's warmer than it sounds." Susanna nodded mutely, still wrapped in his coat, and watched as he tucked the little girl Clara she would learn into a bed piled high with quilts. Then he glanced back at her, his eyes lingering just a moment longer than expected. Not suspicious, just careful. "Rest," he said simply. "You'll need it." The grain room was barely wider than a bed, its walls lined with burlap sacks of oats and barley. But there was a cot, there was a blanket, and for the first time in weeks there was silence that didn't feel like abandonment. Susanna lay down, pulling the wool tight around her. She didn't sleep, not fully, but her eyes closed against the storm, and that was enough. Morning came quietly, soft gray light seeping through the grain room door. For a fleeting moment, Susanna forgot where she was, the cracked station platform, the man who had dismissed her, the cold that had gnawed her bones. Then she felt the weight of Caleb's wool coat still around her shoulders and the hum of warmth from the stove beyond the wall. She slipped barefoot onto the planks, careful not to wake the house. The kitchen glowed dimly with the remnants of fire. Clara sat at the table, her tiny legs swinging as she bit into toast, slick with jam. The child froze when she noticed Susanna, as if testing whether this guest had been a dream. "Good morning," Susanna whispered. "Morning," Clara said, her voice small but certain. There was a wash basin near the stove and a few shirts hanging dry on a line. Susanna moved without thinking, warming water in the kettle, folding the laundry into neat little stacks, wiping the table clean. Clara watched silent and wide-eyed, her jam-stained hands idle now. When the water was warm, Susanna knelt and washed Clara's fingers gently, untangling her wild curls before tying them with a faded blue ribbon she found on the mantel. The front door opened with a hiss of cold. Caleb stepped in from the barn boots, heavy hat dusted white. He stopped short, taking in the folded shirts, the tame curls, the quiet scene. Something unreadable flickered across his face, then vanished. "You didn't have to do that," he said, pulling off his gloves. "I wanted to," Susanna replied quickly, then softer. "It's the least I can do." He said nothing, only poured himself coffee and slid a slice of bread across the table toward her. It wasn't quite gratitude, but it was something. Later that morning, after Caleb headed out to chop wood, Susanna pulled a small tin tub from the mudroom and set it near the stove. She filled it carefully, testing the water with her wrist. Clara hovered nearby, clinging to her flannel nightgown, wary. Just like a summer creek, Susanna coaxed gently, only cozier. Clara dipped one toe, then another. Within minutes, she was sitting in the bath, curls damp and cheeks flushed, as Susanna poured water over her shoulders with a tin cup. A shy giggle escaped the child, then blossomed into full laughter, clear, bright, startling. Outside, Caleb paused mid-swing, the axe frozen above the chopping block. Through the frost-dusted glass, he saw Clara's laughter shake her small shoulders, while Susanna hummed softly, sleeves rolled, eyes tender. He didn't smile. He seemed out of practice, but his jaw loosened as if the sound itself had thawed something. By evening, the warmth of that moment carried Susanna into boldness she hadn't earned yet. Determined to help, she attempted stew. She stoked the fire too high, scorched the meat, and forgot to stir. Soon, the cabin filled with the bitter stench of charred grease. The door banged open. Caleb strode in, arms dusted with hay, and stopped dead. What in God's name? I was trying to make supper, Susanna stammered, clutching the spoon like a weapon. You'll burn the place down if you keep guessing, he snapped sharp as a whip crack. The words hit harder than he meant. Susanna flinched, eyes wide. I'm sorry, she whispered. Before he could speak again, she fled through the mudroom across the yard and into the barn's dim quiet. She sank into the hay arms wrapped around her knees. The horses shifted in their stalls, warm and silent as tears she hadn't given permission for slipped hot down her cheeks. Much later, a faint tap broke the stillness. Not at the barn door at the grain room wall. She rose wary and followed it back. Clara stood there, barefoot curls mussed from sleep, clutching a single shortbread cookie in her small hand. I saved one, the child announced solemnly. It's sweet. Susanna knelt, blinking back fresh tears. You didn't have to. Papa yells a lot, Clara said, matter-of-factly, but he likes when someone stays. Then the little girl stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Susanna's neck. It was quick but fierce, the kind of hug that fixes things words can't. The cookie crumbled between them. Susanna let out a shaky laugh as something in her chest unknotted. She tucked Clara back into bed and stood alone in the quiet kitchen afterward, unsure what to do with the warmth that hug had left behind. When she woke the next morning, the fire was low but steady, and the cabin smelled faintly of coffee. At the foot of her cot lay her travel dress, the one with the seam she had torn on the train platform. The rip had been stitched closed. The thread was uneven, the work plain but strong. She lifted it in both hands, breath caught. He had noticed. He had cared enough to mend it. And for the first time, she wondered if she might not be invisible here after all. The days grew longer, though the cold still clung to the earth like a secret. Snow sagged from the cabin roof in thick slabs. Water trickled from the eaves by midday, only to freeze again by nightfall. Life at the McAllister Ranch found its rhythm. Clara's bright chatter, the creak of the barn door at dawn, the clean split of Caleb's axe through pine. Susanna kept her head down her hands, busy as if usefulness could armor her from doubt. But beyond the ranch, the world had not forgotten where she came from. By the second week, Clearwater Junction had its story. The runaway mail-order bride, the widower rancher, a cabin tucked against the ridge. It was too easy a tale for people hungry to gossip through the long Montana winter. At the mercantile, a woman pulled her son sharply closer when Susanna reached for the same jar of preserves. On the boardwalk, men offered half smirks disguised as tips of their hats. At church, she felt eyes on her like cold rain down her back. Mail-order misfit, someone muttered as she passed, probably hoping he's desperate enough to keep her. Another whispered, not quietly enough. She told herself words were only air, but air can choke just as well as water if it gathers thick enough around you. The final blow came at the feed store. Caleb had Clara balanced on his hip, her small boots swinging. Susanna waited by the sleigh-gloved hands clasped when a man she didn't recognize clapped Caleb on the shoulder. Well, well, the man drawled his grin loose with whiskey. What's next? You marrying her and opening a daycare. The laughter that followed landed like a slap. Caleb didn't laugh. His jaw tightened. His eyes went flint hard. He said nothing, but his silence hit like a hammer on iron. Susanna felt her cheeks burn hot against the freezing air. She turned away so neither man could see her expression, though Caleb wasn't looking at her at all. That night, after the fire had burned low and the cabin slipped into its hush, she packed. There wasn't much: the mended dress folded carefully, the spare apron, the thin handkerchief from back east, her travel-worn satchel. She tied the strap tight and stood for a long moment at the door. Clara's faint breathing drifted from the little bedroom. Caleb's boots were still by the hearth, the leather dark from snow. She lifted the latch and stepped out into the cold. The air cut like broken glass. The snow squeaked under her boots. Shame kept her warm for the first half-mile. Fear carried her the rest. She didn't know where she was going, just that she could not keep staying where she wasn't wanted. She'd almost reached the line where the road disappeared into forest when a low voice cut through the night. "Where you going?" She froze. Caleb's figure materialized from the dark coat, flaring snow crunching under his stride. His breath smoked in the moonlight. Maybe east she managed. Maybe south. Maybe there's still a train. "You're not just some mouth to feed," he interrupted, rough, out of breath. "Then, what am I?" She demanded, the words sharper than she meant, born from nights of swallowing too much. "Because all I see in town are whispers and stares. Like I'm nothing." "You're not nothing." The words hit her like the first crack of spring ice. Caleb stepped closer, the snow snapping under his boots. "You're someone this place didn't know it needed," he said. "Since you walked through that door, there's been laughter again. Clara laughs again. She watches you, follows you. I don't need someone to fold laundry or cook stew. I need someone who gives a damn, and you do even when it's hard." Her throat tightened painfully. "You don't belong to them," he said, softer now. "Not the folks in town. Not the man who left you at that station. You belong wherever you decide you do." A gust of wind tugged at her shawl. The satchel strap cut into her palm. Then Caleb reached out and took the satchel from her hands. He didn't throw it aside, just held it gently, like he understood what it cost her to carry. "You're not leaving tonight," he said. Her lips parted. "And tomorrow." "Tomorrow," he said after a long pause, "you'll still be needed here." Something inside her broke and rebuilt in the same breath. She nodded once. He slung the satchel over his shoulder, turned back toward the cabin, and she followed. This time they walked side by side. The storm that night passed quickly, leaving a hard, glassy crust over the snowdrifts. Morning light threw diamonds across the fields. Caleb spent it mending a loose plank in one of the stalls, while Susanna swept the kitchen, humming under her breath. The old Mustang, restless after weeks, penned up, pawed, and snorted as Caleb bent to check a nail. It happened in a blur, a flash of hooves, a heavy thud, a grunt. By the time Susanna heard the crash and sprinted to the barn, Caleb was slumped in the hay teeth, bared in a grimace, his hand clamped to his thigh. Blood seeped through a ragged tear in his jeans. "Stay still," she said, voice taut. "I'm fine," he muttered, though the gray around his mouth said otherwise. She fetched a basin of warm water-cloth and a battered tin of salve. He let her help him into the cabin and onto the bench by the stove. Steam curled up from his soaked pant leg as she cut the fabric away. It was the first time she had been this close to him, not across a room or in passing, but here, skin and breath and silence. The cut wasn't deep, but it bled stubbornly. Her hands trembled as she dabbed the wound, clean the cloth, coming away red. Caleb watched her with unreadable stillness. Her fingers brushed his skin. She froze. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly. Her eyes flicked to his, wide and wet. "No one's ever said that to me," she whispered. He didn't reply. She wrapped the wound in clean cloth, slow and careful, every motion like an apology neither of them owed. When it was done, she sat back on her heels, hands limp in her lap, unsure what to do with the thundering in her chest. Soft footsteps padded from the hallway. Clara appeared dragging her one-eyed stuffed bear. She looked between them with solemn gravity, then held the bear out to Susanna. For her, she said. Susanna blinked. For me. She cries when she's scared, Clara explained simply. Like you did. You can hold her now. Susanna took the bear with both hands, her voice thin. Thank you. Clara climbed onto the bench beside her father, tucking herself under his arm while keeping her eyes fixed on Susanna. Caleb looked at them both, his face unreadable, but something in the room had shifted quiet and irreversible. It didn't need a name. It simply was. The wind came first crawling down from the high peaks in low moans that rattled the shutters. By late afternoon, the sky had gone the color of tarnished silver, and the air grew heavy, as if the whole world were holding its breath. Caleb nailed boards across the weaker windows, while Susanna drew buckets of water and stacked firewood inside. Even Clara seemed to understand. Her voice subdued her big eyes, following them from hearth to hallway, as if she sensed the mountain had turned against them. By nightfall, the blizzard had them caged. Snow fell sideways, whipped by a gale that howled around the cabin like wolves in the dark. The world beyond the walls vanished into white. Wind forced its way through the seams of the door, through every crack in the logs, until the fire snapped and hissed as though resisting the cold's teeth. And then Clara began to cough. It started as a soft rasp, but within an hour her cheeks had flushed crimson, her breath coming in short, hot gasps. She whimpered, even in sleep, her small fists twisting in the blanket. Susanna pressed her palm to the child's forehead and felt heat sear through her skin. She's burning up, she whispered. Caleb stood frozen across the room, his face, pale jaw clenched so tight it trembled. He was a man used to broken fence rails, to wild horses and midnight calving, but this tiny gasping child seemed to hollow him out. "I'll get Doc Walker," he said abruptly, reaching for his coat. "You won't make it," Susanna shot back. "The pass'll be drifted shut before you hit the river bend. You'll freeze before you get halfway." Then what his voice cracked sharp, panicked. "Just sit here while I stay," she cut in steady, though her heart raced. "We keep her warm. We do what we can." He stared at her for a long beat, breath harsh, then gave a single tight nod. Susanna didn't sit down for the next 12 hours. She layered quilts over Clara's shivering body, stoked the fire until it roared boiled water in endless rounds, and pressed warm cloths to the child's flushed skin. She whispered stories from a home she hadn't spoken of in months. She sang soft lullabies in a voice barely above the hiss of the fire. "She likes your voice," Caleb murmured once from the doorway, his shadow thrown long by the flames. "I'm not singing for her," Susanna said without looking up. "I'm singing for hope." He said nothing, just sank into a chair and stared at the fire as if daring it to go out. The storm screamed outside, the wind shaking the roof like a living thing. Caleb didn't sleep. He chopped more wood, though they had enough, paced the cabin with trembling hands, fed the fire, as if he could outmuscle fate. And all the while, he watched her, watched how she brushed sweat from Clara's brow, how she cradled the child even when her own shoulders sagged, how she whispered comfort, not because she must, but because she loved her. That realization struck him harder than any winter wind. This woman loved his daughter. The gray of morning came slow, more absence of dark than light. Susanna was still in the rocking chair, hair damp at her temples, eyes hollow with exhaustion. Clara lay curled in her lap, breathing shallow but steady. The fire crackled low. Caleb stood by the table, one hand gripping the chair back so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He didn't dare speak, afraid any sound would break whatever fragile thing was happening. And then Clara stirred. Her lashes fluttered once, twice. Her small hand rose and touched Susanna's cheek. Mama stayed. She mumbled, her voice rough with sleep, but clear enough to echo through the room like a church bell. Caleb stopped breathing. Susanna's lips parted, but no sound came. Clara blinked up at her again, certainty in her sleepy eyes. "Mama," she said softly. Susanna's throat caught on a sob that didn't quite escape. Caleb crossed the room in 3 strides. He didn't speak at first. He just knelt beside the rocker, rested one large hand on Susanna's shoulder, his thumb brushing her sleeve with uncharacteristic gentleness. "I heard her," he said, voice low and hoarse. "I heard her call you that." Susanna nodded faintly, eyes glistening. "I didn't teach her to," she whispered. "You didn't have to." For a long time, they stayed like that, Caleb on the floor, Susanna in the rocker. Clara curled between them like the smallest, fiercest kind of bridge. The storm quieted. The wind gave up its hunt. The cabin was warm, and in that warmth, something in Caleb McAllister that had been locked in winter for years gave its first cautious stir toward spring. Not just gratitude, but trust. Not just trust, but the first trembling edge of something braver. Love not demanded, not declared, but earned in the quiet fight of a night that could have taken everything and hadn't. Spring came shyly to the mountains, tiptoeing in on streams of meltwater and threads of green pushing through the thawing earth. Where drifts had once stood like walls, the land now softened into deep mud and patches of wild grass. The air smelled faintly of pine sap and wet soil. Birds returned in flitting bursts of color. Horses galloped restless and bright-eyed in the pasture, their hooves drumming like distant thunder. Susanna stood by the fence one afternoon, hands resting on the top rail, watching them run. Wind tugged strands of hair loose from her braid, lifted the hem of her skirt. She was no longer the trembling girl who had clutched a satchel on a frozen train platform. Her eyes were steady now, her shoulders sure a quiet strength woven into her frame like thread into cloth. Behind her, Caleb approached without sound. He never made noise when he didn't have to. She felt his presence before his hand settled on her shoulder, warm and certain. "You never signed up for this life," he said softly, "but you stayed. For her, for me." Susanna's fingers curled on the rail. "I didn't stay because I had no choice," she murmured. "I stayed because I found one." He stood in silence for a long breath, as though the earth itself were listening. The cabin had changed with the season. Where once it had been a hollow place echoing with quiet, it now pulsed with life. Susanna moved through it like she had always belonged, lighting lamps, folding linens, humming to herself as she stirred pots over the stove. Clara followed her like a shadow, copying the way she braided her hair, the way she swept the floor, the way she murmured to the horses as if they understood. Each morning, Caleb saddled up before the sun climbed the ridge. But now, before he rode out, he always passed through the kitchen where Susanna stood barefoot, in a warm robe pouring coffee. He'd pause to place his hand at the small of her back, lean close and whisper, "Back before supper, darling." Always darling now, and he always came back. The townsfolk noticed the change before they admitted it. Where once they'd narrowed their eyes now, they offered quiet nods. They came to trade seeds, to buy colts, to ask Susanna about coughs, bruises, letters. She never sought their approval, but like everything else here, she earned it with steady hands and patience. One evening, Clara came skidding into the kitchen, clutching a sheet of paper, cheeks flushed. She slapped it down on the table between the supper plates. 3 stick figures stood beneath a drawn cabin, a bright red heart floating above them. "This is Mama Clara," said, pointing to the figure with long hair. "This is Papa, and this is us." Caleb froze mid-bite. Susanna reached across and took Clara's paint-smudged hand. No words passed between them, but the kind of stillness that settles after storms filled the room soft and sure as a quilt. Weeks later, the porch bloomed with wildflowers Susanna had planted the year before, never knowing if they'd survive the frost. They danced in the breeze like a promise kept. After supper, one golden evening as the sun sagged low and the hills glowed, Amber Caleb caught her hand. "Come outside," he said. They stepped beneath the trellis now twined with flowering vines. The air hummed with crickets. The world smelled alive. "I thought I buried my heart the day Clara's mama died," Caleb said, voice low. "Sure, I'd never dig it back up. But you made it beat again." Susanna's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to say it so plainly, so open. "I didn't come here looking for love," she whispered. "I didn't even know what it felt like." "No one ever taught me how to start again," he said, almost smiling. "But you made it seem simple." He reached into his vest pocket, then stopped. No ring, no velvet box. Instead, he dropped to one knee on the worn porch boards. "I don't need a preacher or a paper," he said. "Just your word. Let me show you every single day for the rest of our lives." Tears blurred the world. Susanna pressed a hand to her mouth, laughing through them. "Get up," she whispered, pulling him gently to his feet. She wrapped her arms around his chest. "You already have." He kissed her hair, his breath shaky. Then he reached into his coat and drew out a tiny carved horse, smooth and sanded, tied with a red ribbon. Etched beneath its belly were the initials SM. "I made it after that night," he said, "when she called you Mama." Susanna clutched it to her chest. "She still does," she whispered, breaking on the words. "Because you are," he said simply. That night, the three of them sat on the porch swing together. Clara curled in Susanna's lap, one small hand tangled in her shawl, already half asleep. The stars blinked overhead, sharp and countless. The hills lay quiet and dark. Caleb wrapped an arm around them both. He watched the firelight flicker through the open door, warm against the cabin's log walls. "This ain't just a house anymore," he murmured. "It's love, and you're the reason it burns." Susanna said nothing. She just laid her head against his shoulder, the carved horse warm in her hand, and breathed. Because love didn't need a name or ceremony. It simply lived, and it burned. Once Susanna had believed being unwanted meant she had no worth, but she learned what so many forget. Your value doesn't depend on who chooses you first, but on who chooses you again and again once they know your heart. If this story stirred something quiet inside, you leave a comment about someone who chose you when you needed it most, and subscribe for more stories like this where love isn't loud but true, because real love isn't found, it's built, and sometimes it saves everyone who helps build it.